Shadows of Detroit. Detroit's streets had always been dark, but for Miles Caldwell, the darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a constant, oppressive presence. At 52, Miles had learned to live with the city's shadows, driving his Uber through its labyrinthine alleys and crumbling neighborhoods. Yet his nightly routes served another purpose: hunting vampires. For 3 years, Miles had pursued the creatures that prowled the city's depths. It began the day his twin children, Lila and Brandon, vanished. They were 22 then, full of promise and dreams, until they simply disappeared. The police chalked it up to a runaway case, but Miles knew better. He'd found Brandon's journal a week after they vanished, its pages filled with cryptic notes, strange symbols, and references to the nest. That's when the shadows stopped being a metaphor and became his reality. Night falls. The city lights flickered, casting pale halos over the rain-slicked streets. Miles parked his black Prius at the edge of an abandoned lot in Corktown, where crumbling warehouses stood like tombstones. He checked his Uber app, a few hours until dawn, plenty of time to work. Tonight's client wasn't a fare. It was a lead. His phone buzzed with a notification: pickup request, Street Auburn Avenue. Miles' lips twitched in a grim smile. St. Aubin was close to the riverfront, a hotspot for disappearances. As he drove, he checked the gear in the passenger seat: a modified crossbow, UV flashlights, and vials of holy water. These weren't the tools of a traditional Uber driver, but they'd saved his life more than once. When he arrived, a man in his early 30s stood under a flickering street lamp. He was pale, almost unnaturally so, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. Miles rolled down the window. "Jason?" The man nodded and slid into the back seat, his movements too smooth, too quiet. "Where to?" "Brush Park," Jason replied, his voice low and raspy. Miles tapped the app but kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. Jason's reflection was faint and distorted. Not quite invisible, but close enough. The hunt begins. As Miles drove, he tried to piece together his next move. Over the past 3 years, he'd become something of an expert on vampire lore, staking through the heart, decapitation, and sunlight all worked, though vampires in Detroit seemed more resilient than their Hollywood counterparts. "What brings you out this late?" Miles asked, feigning casual interest. Jason's lips curled into a thin smile. "Work." "Same as you." Miles tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Vampires rarely bothered with subtlety, their arrogance often betrayed them. The car turned into a deserted street, and Miles tapped a hidden button under the dashboard. The doors locked with an audible click. Jason's smile faded. "What are you doing?" "I think you know," Miles said, his voice cold. Jason hissed, his teeth elongating into sharp fangs, but Miles was faster. He slammed on the brakes, throwing Jason forward. In one swift motion, Miles grabbed the crossbow and fired. The wooden bolt struck Jason in the chest, pinning him against the seat. The vampire screamed, his body convulsing as dark ichor oozed from the wound. Miles stepped out of the car, opened the back door, and yanked Jason out onto the pavement. "Where's the nest?" Miles demanded. Jason snarled, clawing at the bolt. "You're too late. They've already found them." Miles froze. "Found who?" Jason laughed, a guttural, wet sound. "Your children." Miles' heart pounded as he drove another bolt into Jason's heart. The vampire crumbled into ash, leaving behind nothing but his mocking laughter echoing in Miles' mind. The nest. Jason's cryptic words left Miles shaken but resolute. He knew the nest was real, and now he had confirmation his children were involved. Whether they were victims or vampires, he couldn't be sure, but he had to find them. Miles returned to his modest apartment in southwest Detroit, where a wall of photos, maps, and notes dominated his living room. Strings connected locations of disappearances to symbols found in Brandon's journal. One symbol stood out, a 3-pronged mark resembling a trident. He'd seen it etched into abandoned buildings, carved into victims' bodies, and scrawled in his son's handwriting. His research pointed to an underground club called Eclipse, a haven for the city's nightlife and, according to whispers, a feeding ground for vampires. Into the shadows. Miles arrived at Eclipse just after midnight. The club pulsed with energy, its neon sign casting a blood-red glow. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and sweat, the bass line vibrating in his chest. He scanned the crowd, looking for signs: unnatural stillness, pale skin, predatory gazes. Then he saw her. Lila. She stood at the edge of the dance floor, her once auburn hair now jet black, her eyes colder than he remembered. Miles' breath caught in his throat. "Lila," he whispered, stepping closer. She turned, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he saw recognition flicker in her eyes. "Dad?" Before he could respond, a man appeared beside her, a tall figure with a predatory aura. He placed a possessive hand on her shoulder. "Is this him?" the man asked, his voice dripping with malice. Lila hesitated. "Yes." The man's grin widened, revealing sharp fangs. "Welcome to Eclipse, Mr. Caldwell." The confrontation. Miles didn't wait. He pulled a UV flashlight from his jacket and turned it on. The man recoiled, hissing as his skin blistered. Lila shielded her eyes, screaming, "Stop! You don't understand. Help me understand." Miles shouted, his voice breaking. "What happened to you and Brandon?" Lila stepped between him and the vampire. "He saved us." "Saved you?" Miles spat. "He turned you into monsters." Lila's eyes filled with tears. "You don't know what it's like, Dad. We didn't have a choice." Before Miles could respond, a deafening roar filled the room. The crowd scattered as vampires emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with hunger. Miles fired his crossbow, taking down 2 vampires in quick succession. Lila screamed, "Run," and shoved him toward the exit. Redemption. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, washing away the blood on Miles' hands. He stumbled into an alley, his mind racing. Lila wasn't the same, but she wasn't lost. He could feel it. If she still cared enough to save him, there was hope. But Brandon was still out there, and the nest loomed over the city like a storm cloud. Miles looked at the trident symbol carved into a nearby wall, his resolve hardening. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. For his children, for his city, Miles would face the shadows until there was nothing left of him. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find the light again. Shadows of Detroit, Part 2. The rain didn't let up as Miles leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, the adrenaline of the fight coursing through him like a second heartbeat. Lila was alive. She had looked at him with recognition, with something close to love, but she was different. Changed. And Brandon? If he was still out there, there was no telling what he had become. The weight of the crossbow in his hand brought him back to the moment. The vampires at Eclipse wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. He had to keep moving. His Prius sat a block away, a small island of familiarity in the chaos of his life. As he approached, he scanned the street for any movement. The neon lights from the club behind him danced on the wet pavement, but no shadows moved. Miles slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors with a sharp click. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out his backup phone. His primary device had been left behind in the scuffle. There wasn't time to mourn it. He needed a plan. The call for help. Miles scrolled through his contacts. Most were meaningless, a mix of fares, old colleagues, and acquaintances too distant to be of use. But one name stood out, Reverend Marcus Haynes. Marcus was an unconventional ally. Once a preacher, he had traded his pulpit for a life of hunting the supernatural after losing his congregation to a vampire attack. He and Miles had crossed paths a year ago when a cluster of disappearances led them both to the same abandoned church in Highland Park. They had barely survived that night, but a bond had formed. Miles dialed. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. What's the trouble? I found Lila, Miles said, the words heavy on his tongue. She's alive, Marcus. But she's different. The line was silent for a beat. Did she attack you? No. She warned me. She saved me. I think she's still in there, Marcus. But I need your help. There's a place called the Nest. The Nest? Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. You're sure? Yes. Do you know it? I've heard of it, Marcus admitted. It's not a place, it's a network. A hive for their kind. Finding it is nearly impossible. Destroying it? Even harder. Miles tightened his grip on the phone. I don't care how hard it is. They have my son. And if Lila's still human enough to save me, then there's hope for Brandon. There was a pause before Marcus answered. Meet me at St. Anne's Church. Bring everything you've got. The gathering storm. St. Anne's Church stood as a beacon of defiance in the decaying heart of Detroit. Its stained glass windows were cracked, its steeple leaning slightly to one side, but it remained a sanctuary. Marcus had set up shop in the basement, turning the sacred space into an armory of holy relics and improvised weaponry. Miles arrived just before dawn, his clothes damp and his resolve hardened. Marcus greeted him at the door, a large man with a shaved head and eyes that seemed to see straight through a person's soul. He was cleaning a silver-edged machete when Miles entered. You look like hell, Marcus said, not unkindly. I've seen worse, Miles replied, setting his gear on a table. What do you know about the Nest? Marcus sighed, sitting down heavily. The Nest isn't just a haven for vampires. It's their heart, their brain. The ones who control the city operate from there. If your kids are tied to it, we're dealing with something bigger than just bloodsuckers looking for a meal. Miles nodded. I don't care how big it is. I need to find them. Marcus studied him for a moment. You're not just hunting vampires anymore, Miles. You're walking into their lair. If we do this, there's no guarantee either of us comes out. I don't need guarantees, Miles said. I need answers. Into the abyss. The two men spent the next few hours preparing. Marcus shared what little intelligence he had gathered over the years. The Nest wasn't a single location but a network of underground tunnels and safe houses spanning the city. The vampires moved between them like rats in the sewers. One location, however, stood out, a recently abandoned meatpacking plant on the city's outskirts. It had been marked with the same trident symbol Miles had seen in Brandon's journal. That's where we start, Marcus said, loading shells into a sawed-off shotgun. If they're there, we'll know soon enough. The drive to the plant was tense. The city's skyline loomed in the rearview mirror, the distant hum of life a stark contrast to the desolation ahead. The plant came into view, a hulking structure of rusted steel and broken windows. The air smelled of decay. Miles parked a block away, cutting the engine. The two men approached on foot, their weapons ready. A low hum emanated from the building, too rhythmic to be machinery. As they entered, the sound resolved into something more chilling, chanting. The ritual. The main floor of the plant had been transformed into a grotesque altar. Blood stained the walls, and candles flickered in a circle around a massive pit. Vampires stood in the shadows, their eyes glowing like embers. At the center of it all was Brandon. Miles' heart nearly stopped. His son looked older, harder. His hair was longer, his face pale and angular, but there was no mistaking him. He wore a black robe, the trident symbol emblazoned on its chest. Brandon! Miles called out before Marcus could stop him. Brandon turned, his expression unreadable. Dad, he said, his voice cold. You shouldn't have come here. Miles stepped forward, his crossbow aimed at the ground. I came to bring you home. You and Lila. Brandon's eyes softened for a moment, but the look was fleeting. There is no home. Not anymore. The vampires closed in, their growls low and menacing. Marcus fired his shotgun, the blast echoing in the cavernous space. Chaos erupted as the creatures attacked. Miles fought with the desperation of a father, taking down one vampire after another, but there were too many. "Dad, stop!" Brandon shouted, stepping between Miles and the horde. "You don't understand. We're not the enemy." Miles froze. "What are you talking about?" Brandon gestured to the pit. "The nest isn't just a place. It's a being. And it's waking up. If we don't stop it, it will consume everything, humans and vampires alike." A father's choice. Miles' mind raced. Could he trust Brandon? Could he risk believing that his son, his boy, was still in there? The ground shook as a deep, guttural roar erupted from the pit. The vampires scattered, their fear palpable. A massive, shadowy figure began to rise, its form shifting and indistinct. Brandon turned to Miles. "If you want to save us, if you want to save her, help me stop this." Miles looked at Marcus, who nodded grimly. Together, they stood beside Brandon, facing the monstrous entity emerging from the pit. For the first time in years, Miles felt a flicker of hope. But hope wasn't enough to banish the darkness. It was only the beginning. Shadows of Detroit, Part 3. The roar of the creature rising from the pit reverberated through the meatpacking plant. Its form was massive yet fluid, shifting like smoke coiling in darkness. Crimson eyes burned in its featureless face, and jagged shadows extended like tendrils, writhing and reaching for anything near. Miles gripped his crossbow tightly, his breath hitching as the sheer enormity of the thing sank in. It wasn't just a vampire, it was something older, something far beyond his understanding. "What the hell is that?" Marcus growled, cocking his shotgun. "The nest," Brandon said, his voice tinged with both fear and awe. "It's not just their home. It's their god." Miles glanced at his son. "How do we stop it?" Brandon hesitated. "We can't, not fully. But we can weaken it. The trident sigils you've been seeing? They're anchors, binding its power. Destroy enough of them, and it'll collapse." "Convenient timing to tell me," Miles shot back. "You weren't ready," Brandon said, his tone sharp. "You needed to see what we're up against." Marcus fired at the creature, the silver-tipped bullets whizzing into the mass. The rounds dissolved in the shadowy form, leaving no visible effect. The thing roared again, the sound shaking the ground. "Less arguing, more doing," Marcus barked. "Where are these anchors?" Brandon pointed to the walls of the plant, where 3 massive trident symbols glowed faintly, pulsing like veins under the surface. "Those. They're holding it here. Fighting through shadows." The creature's tendrils lashed out, crashing into steel beams and sending shards of rusted metal clattering to the floor. Miles rolled out of the way, firing a bolt at one of the tridents. The enchanted wood struck true, shattering the symbol in a shower of sparks. The creature recoiled, its form flickering for a moment before reconstituting itself. "That worked!" Miles shouted. "Keep going!" Brandon urged. Marcus charged toward the second symbol, shotgun blasting at the vampires that swarmed to defend it. He moved with the precision of a seasoned hunter, but there were too many. A vampire leapt onto his back, fangs snapping at his neck. Marcus roared, slamming the creature into a wall before finishing it with a silver dagger. "Move, old man!" Marcus yelled to Miles as he cleared a path. Miles sprinted toward the second trident, pulling a UV grenade from his belt. He activated it, hurling it at the symbol. The grenade detonated in a burst of searing light, obliterating the sigil and incinerating the nearby vampires. The creature howled, its form convulsing and shrinking slightly. "Two down!" Miles called out. The ground shook again, and the creature lashed out with renewed fury. A tendril struck Marcus, sending him sprawling across the room. He landed hard, coughing up blood but still clutching his shotgun. Miles rushed to his side. "Marcus!" "I'm fine," Marcus wheezed, his face pale. Get the last one. A family divided. The final trident symbol loomed on the far side of the room, but vampires swarmed around it, their glowing eyes fixed on Miles. He readied his crossbow, but Brandon stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Wait, Brandon said. Let me handle this. What are you doing? Miles demanded. Brandon's expression was pained. If you destroy the last anchor, you'll weaken the nest, but you'll weaken us, too. Lila and we're bound to it. If it collapses, we might not survive. Miles stared at him, the weight of the choice bearing down on him. You're telling me to let this thing live? After everything it's done? I'm telling you to think about what you're doing, Brandon said, his voice breaking. If you destroy it, you might save the city, but you'll lose us. That thing took you from me, Miles said, his hands trembling. It turned you into this. You and Lila. Brandon's jaw clenched. We're still your kids, Dad. Don't make this choice without thinking it through. Behind them, the creature roared, its tendrils lashing out wildly. Marcus groaned, struggling to stand, his blood pooling on the ground. The vampires hissed and shrieked, readying for another assault. Make the call, Miles. Marcus shouted. We don't have time. The choice. Miles looked from Brandon to the trident symbol and back. His mind raced, torn between saving his children and destroying the evil that had plagued the city. He thought of Lila's eyes at Eclipse, the way she had pushed him to safety. He thought of Brandon standing here now, pleading with him. But he also thought of the lives lost, the families torn apart. If the nest remained, it would only grow stronger. I'm sorry, Miles said, his voice cracking. Brandon's eyes widened. Dad, no. Miles fired his crossbow. The bolt struck the final trident, shattering it. The entire room was bathed in a blinding light as the symbol exploded, sending shockwaves through the plant. The creature screamed, its form collapsing in on itself, dragging the remaining vampires into the void. Brandon dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. Dad. Miles rushed to him, catching him before he fell. Brandon, hold on. You'll be okay. Brandon shook his head. It's too late. You did the right thing. His voice grew weaker with each word. Tell Lila. I'm sorry. No, Miles whispered, tears streaming down his face. Don't do this, son. Don't leave me. Brandon gave a faint smile. You saved me. You saved everyone. His body turned to ash in Miles' arms, scattering in the wind. Aftermath. The plant was eerily silent. The creature was gone, and the vampires with it. Marcus leaned against a wall, clutching his wounded side, his expression grim. You did it, Marcus said. Miles didn't respond. He stared at the pile of ash where Brandon had been, his heart shattered. He had saved the city, but the cost was unbearable. Lila was still out there. She had to be. If Brandon had survived as long as he had, maybe she could, too. Maybe there was still hope for her. Miles stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He helped Marcus to his feet and the two of them limped out of the ruined plant, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. For Lila, for Brandon's memory, and for the city he had come to love, Miles would keep hunting. Because the shadows of Detroit were never truly gone, they just waited for the light to fade.